This is not original to me. I read a book entitled How Not to Be Wrong. I will introduce the author in a few minutes. And this is the title of one of the chapters in here. There is no such thing as public opinion. I'd like you to introduce yourselves maybe in a couple of words. Why did you sign up for this class?
Paul Sharp, and this, I don't know, it was just seemed like an interesting topic to me. I agree with the idea behind it, so that's why I wanted.
My name is Barbara Mann, and I put my raffle in a basket and I won a class. And so I thought, well, this looks interesting, and so that's why I'm here.
Okay.
Peggy Sharp, and I agree with your book and disagree with Paul's.
Okay.
I'm Lynn Randall. I tend to agree with the concept, but as a lifelong market researcher, I also know how people tweak data and how they tweak questionnaires to get the answers they want. So
That's a good word, tweet.
tweak. So I'm curious what a statistician would say about it.
Yep.
Roger Sakara, and I spent most of my professional life in consulting to corporations on management selection. I have an academic background that includes formulation of surveys. And so I think we're facing a major issue in our society about polls.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Bob Nuclerio, and I guess I echo a lot of this. Life has changed pretty drastically with the internet and polls and people putting out false information and influencing opinion. I didn't know how much of this was going to be dealt with in this topic.
Hi, I'm Ron Weber, and I've taken a couple courses with you, so I know it'd be interesting.
Doesn't matter the topic, it's you.
I'm Annabelle Lesher. I have to keep an eye on it, so I'm there.
And I'm Doug Holly, and yeah, I'm looking for some additional insights. I like to have discussions about difficult topics,
Okay.
but it's difficult, so I'm hoping to get some insights on how to have it in a more meaningful way.
Okay. Okay, good. I should say a little bit about my own background. I started in teaching and left teaching because somebody offered me to go to graduate school over an increase in income over what I was making as a teacher. And I wound up in the New Jersey Department of Education. I worked there for almost 25 years, retired at age 50, took a year off, and then a property that had belonged to my wife's aunt and uncle came on the market down here, and our oldest son, Pete, gave us a call one Saturday afternoon and said, "The harbor is being sold. What are you going to do about it?" And that's how I wound up down here. And I started substituting and wound up teaching calculus and physics at St. Peter and Paul until they decided that I needed to retire. Second retirement, maybe the third, I don't know. I've lost count. In any case, what I'm going to present to you is not my ideas. It's the ideas in one chapter in this book. It's written in 2014 by Jordan Ellenberg. He was a brilliant student here in Montgomery County, graduated from high school early, and he is currently a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's written several books. I've read all that I'm aware that he has published. Two of them are math books. He's a math professor. The third is a novel, interestingly enough. So, let's get to our first example, and I invite you at any time, ask questions. If you have a comment to make, please do so. This book was published in 2014, so the examples are a little bit low, but I think, a little bit old, but I think they're relevant, continue to be relevant today. So we're gonna look, first of all, at a February 2011 Pew Research poll. And we know that is a reputable polling group. In the poll, there were 13 categories of government spending, and people responded in 11 of those. They wanted to increase spending in those 11 out of 13 categories, regardless of whether there is a deficit or no deficit. They wanted to increase spending. And the only two that they didn't was foreign aid and unemployment insurance. And those two only count for less than 5% of the federal government's budget. Okay? And then his comment, oh yeah, we want smaller government. Wait a minute. Which way are we going? We want to increase spending in 11 out of 13, and then we say, in the next breath, we want smaller government. Okay?
Just a question.
Yeah.
Who did they sample? Because that seems to be a bigger and bigger.
And I don't know. Ellenberg doesn't tell us that. I don't know who they say.
You can find that poll online, probably, the Pew Research keeps them. But the problem here is not that stating that people did this. The problem is in the analysis of the data. They should have been able to, well, anyway.
I agree, and that's certainly one of the takeaways, that the way in which we decide to analyze the data and how we present the data, and I'm going to ask you some questions about how we present some results in one of the later polls, okay? Okay. They also looked at the state level in the poll, and most states, if not all states, require that the budget be balanced. States are not allowed to run deficits, okay? So they favored a combination of raising taxes and cutting programs in order to keep the state budgets balanced. The results were, should we cut funding for education, healthcare, or transportation, or pensions? And none of those had a majority support. In other words, don't cut those if we have to balance the budget, okay? How are we going to do? Well, if we don't want to cut those, how about raising the sales tax or the state income tax or taxes on business? And again, none of them has a majority support. How are we going to report those results?
Well, we don't know what the question was, so it's.
Okay. Ellenberg says, most people seem to want to cut down the forest, but to keep the trees. I mean, if you look at the state results, that's indeed sort of what they're asking to do. Don't cut those programs. Don't raise taxes. Wait a minute. How are we going to keep the budget balanced then? Those are the conclusions. Okay. That's the first conclusion. That's Ellenberg's conclusion. An economist by the name of Brian Kaplan said, it's very clear, people want a free lunch, right? Let's spend less on government without touching any of its main functions. And that seems to be a reasonable way to look at those results. We aren't very consistent. You may recognize this name, Paul Krugman. People want spending cut, but are opposed to cuts in anything except foreign aid. Okay? And then he says, well, obviously the only way to do that is to repeal the laws of arithmetic. Okay.
Those are all three valid conclusions based on.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. What do we make out of that? I mean, are these results the kinds of results that we seem to see in polls today?
Yes,
Absolutely.
But I think it actually accurately reflects how most people think.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, they don't understand how it works.
Right there, right?
A lot of times polls have been regurgitated by the press. And so you get people who don't understand, or don't go into depth into to see if the polls.
We'll get there.
But I don't think these polls, this is exactly what I would have expected. Because, right, none of us, how many of you remember when we were in the war in Vietnam? They actually, LBJ raised taxes. There was a tax increase temporarily to help fund that war. If we had done that during Iraq and all those things, might have looked at it a little bit differently.
Okay.
We don't seem to have that will anymore.
Or to have the Desert Storm or 9/11.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So now we're going to look at a hypothetical. I think I had this in the advertisement for the course. How should we address the budget deficit? And people were given three choices. And a third of them said, raise taxes. A third of them said, cut defense. And the third said, cut Medicare. What do we conclude from that?
But the people that want to cut Medicare are not 65.
How do raised taxes come up when you're talking about cutting the deficit or addressing the, I see.
Oh, addressing the budget deficit. You either got to cut programs or you've got to raise
Yeah.
taxes.
Do they have like a correlation between following up on that on the age?
This is purely a hypothetical survey invented.
I guess I would guess that a lot of those things depend on people's age.
They often do, and almost always the researchers can cross-tabulate demographics.
Yeah. Okay.
Who's on? It's being recorded.
Each person that responds, I think we would agree, has perfectly rational reason for the way in which they respond. But when you look at the results in the aggregate, they don't make any sense. In large part, this is because most Americans think the programs that benefit them personally are the ones that must, at all costs, be preserved. Isn't that how we all react? We just had that comment earlier, right? If they want to cut Medicare, they're obviously.
Not talking. Well, another example that locally would be that the county's going to have to keep that, that tax that they said would only be for 2 years because they now need the money because they no longer get the money from the government. So people who, a lot of times I'm not sure if that tax affected schools or not, but let's say it's a tax for schools, people who live in retirement communities have a tendency to say, no, we don't want that. Even though it impacts us all directly because we all want young people who are educated to be part of our community.
There was an editorial this weekend in the Star Democrat that I would urge you to read because it had to do with the plan for schools reaching out into the future. And all of them have budgetary implications. Now, I remember attending a fair number of years ago a county council meeting in which one of the county council members, not the current county council, bragged about how low Talbot County taxes were in comparison to other counties in the state of Maryland. And the support for education was second low of any county in the state. Now, in that editorial, they state that that's the one category which the county council may increase, even though they're not, and above the percentage that they're permitted to require by law. So that strategy was probably 6-7 years ago of keeping us as the second lowest county in support of our schools. And the person who said that was very proud of that fact. She was bragging about it. She's no longer a member of county council, by the way. Okay. Ellenberg concludes, perhaps we're not selfish, but none of us are stupid. Right?
Not individually.
I heard that, Bill.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it depends how we aggregate these results, as we're going to find out.
Oh, we asked the kind of question that demographic studies, how smart are you?
Right.
Oh, we're gonna roll the average.
And Garrison Keeler, all the children are above average.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Democracy. We agree that the majority rules, right? Isn't that what our country is based on? That seems so simple. It's elegant. It's fair, right? But Ellenberg claims that the majority system upon which our country runs only works if there are at most 2 choices. If there are more than 2 choices, we've got some problems. Okay? Yes?
The trouble with this, when you talk about country, right, it's not the majority that rules. It's locally the states that rule who is going to run the government. And that's, so, it really is the majority rules in the local situation, right? So in other words, if Talbot County or the city of Easton, the majority doesn't want something, then it may be able to do it. Whereas the government or someone else. So it's the majority in the group that's included.
But again, Ellenberg says, regardless of what level of government we're talking about, we like to believe that the majority are rules, but we're going to look at some examples where there are more than 2 choices. And how do we draw valid conclusions? How do we arrive? I'm going to jump ahead for a moment. The election coming up in November for president in many states is going to have at least 3 choices. There are other times when we've had that, and we're going to look at some examples and complications that arise when there are more than 2 choices. And that's one of the things that I want you to leave here with today. And one of the difficulties we have in this system, which we believe in, we say we believe in, it's really hard to draw how do you draw conclusions from that is a little bit more complicated than most of us have realized. Okay? All right. Another poll, October 2010 on the Affordable Care Act. Here's how the results were reported. 52% opposed the Affordable Care Act. 41% supported it. And then in the follow-up to that, in this survey, 37% said we need to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. 10% suggested weakening it. 15% suggested leaving it as it is. 36% suggested expansion of the Affordable Care Act.
This was before or after, I don't remember when it was passed.
I don't remember, I think it's after it has passed.
That was 2000.
Yeah, okay. Now, I'm going to give you a task. You are all on the staff of Fox News, and I want us to create a headline for Fox News based on these poll results. How is Fox News going to report this?
Still,
They probably combine the
52%
first two.
opposed,
Oh,
37%.
The majority are opposed to the Affordable Care Act, right?
Yeah, but how did they get that?
Was,
Well, this was one of the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now,
Doesn't make sense because take the two bottom, 36 and.
hold off on that.
Okay.
Okay, now your task is,
how would MSNBC? report?
yes, how would MSNBC, what's the headline for MSNBC on this
The bottom question.
Yeah, they would do they'd combine the bottom.
61%.
They suggest leaving the same and suggest expansion.
Fox News, this is Ellenberg. Majority of the Americans oppose the ACA, right? MSNBC, the majority of Americans want to preserve or expand Obamacare. So, what's the problem here? First of all, both of those statements are true.
How?
How? Well, let's go back.
No, we added
Look,
Look, add 15 and 36 at the bottom,
no, but look at this one. 52% opposed
right?
on the first question, right? So Fox News is
Majority opposed.
absolutely correct that the majority of Americans oppose that.
But I don't.
But when you look at down here,
Yeah. Where did they get the 52?
Same poll, it's a poll, different question.
Oh.
it's a different question.
Oh.
You're asking people to be rational, come on.
So the headlines are actually true based on pieces of the survey.
And who their audience is,
And
that they're catering to.
one's over here, and they're both accurate in terms of pieces of the survey. Right?
And they know most people are not going to look
might-
further or question it the way you just
They
did.
might read the lead paragraph.
That's the problem.
And that is part of the problem, but it's greater than that as well. It's true that many of us read the quick summary or the headline, and we stop there. It's a lot more complicated than that. I think we all agree with that.
Well, and some of the majority that opposed Obamacare opposed it because they wanted more than that. They
That's-
wanted it to go
Yeah, you might answer no.
further.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think some of my favorite polls during that time were asking people how they felt about Obamacare and then asking them how they felt about the Affordable Care Act.
Yes.
And they didn't realize they were the same
Same
thing
thing,
and their
right.
answer totally, like,
I remember seeing some of
they're
them.
totally against Obamacare, but the Affordable Care Act is a good
Yeah.
Okay. Let's jump to the 1992 presidential election. We had three choices in that election: Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Ross Perot. And there are the results of the popular vote. If you add these two together, Look at that statement, 57% thought Bill Clinton should not be president. 62% thought George W. Bush should not be president. And 81% thought Ross Perot should not be president. We've got a solution, right? The Electoral College. Because that's how we elect our president, right? Reactions to that?
Except for the times when the popular vote and the electoral college vote were not in sync.
We'll get there. We'll get there. What do we do about that?
Well, thank goodness we have the electoral college, so that some states have some representation.
Okay,
But this is an example of there's three choices instead of two.
that's right. And three choices instead of two makes it very complicated as to how we look at the data.
But something you said here, so every state has something to say. Are states electing the president or are people electing the
Well,
president? And that can be.
And it's the state that has the people who are voting to represent their state
Yeah, but
in the electoral college.
there was one analysis that said that actually, if you did it exactly right, you could elect a president with 32% of the vote.
Uh-huh.
We'll see an example a little bit.
Right. The
Right.
popular vote.
Later.
Right.
Which,
If you
if
only
you
had
get-
a popular vote, that sounds like something
no,
my
no,
husband would say.
no, with electoral college, because if you, the reason the electoral college
Yeah.
works so crazy is because it's an all or nothing type thing. So
Right.
if you win 51% of the vote in one state, you get 100% of the electoral vote, college votes, in most states.
With the exception of about two
Two,
two
two.
states, yeah.
Yeah, but,
But that's the choice of the state, how they want to handle that.
yeah, but it leads to the results like this. It leads to results of, where Trump, had it been based on popular vote, would not have been elected. You know,
Because.
nor would it Bush the first time, So, there is a way out, but, I'm sure we'll get to it.
Aren't some places where there's like more than two, they do like a runoff with the two tops?
Is that the Alaska? Is that Alaska?
They choice
I'm not sure. We're gonna see a different proposal to that. Notion of having to do another election.
A lot of countries do that,
Yeah.
other countries.
Okay, that's what I mean.
We'll see a different proposal a little bit later.
We're the only, I think we're the only democracy with two parties.
Yes.
Yep.
because of the way we've structured our parties.
Yeah.
Well, our founding fathers never thought of parties.
Mhm.
Our founding fathers, they didn't even anticipate
They didn't want
So your argument is we should all make it stricter to be just two parties, right?
it. No.
Any questions, the questions we should, okay, how do I want to say this?
Because it's the third.
When we pose a question, if there are two choices, it's very clear which wins out with the majority rules, okay? If there are three choices, it's not as clear, okay? And trying to analyze the situation when there are three or more choices, and we saw that earlier with where are we going to cut spending? We got 13 categories. What are we going to do, and how do we draw conclusions from that? And Ellenberg's position is that when there are more than two choices, trying to draw conclusions is exceedingly difficult. Well, we saw that in how, when I asked you how would Fox News report this, how would MSNBC, they draw entirely different conclusions, and we see how they aggregated the results, and we agree that both of them have come about in a way that we can't tear them apart and say, well, you analyzed the data wrong. No. Well, not in the example that I gave you. Yeah, I mean, we can argue about that. But I think Ellenberg's position is, it's problematic. It really is problematic when there are more than two possibilities.
Especially in presidential candidates.
Well, it's presidential, it's the earlier survey. So
Which way would that have gone for road drop down? You can take
that's a
those
good,
ways.
well, and again,
I think Bush
Can you
did that.
analyze that? Yeah.
if you simply, yeah,
He was the president.
in a runoff,
Right.
yeah.
It was all about money, and he was the first one to introduce those pie charts.
Yeah, right.
Money pie charts.
Okay.
That would be for Republicans. But, you know, what complicates the presidential election, I mean, let's say you had just two candidates, right? Is that there's now, you divide it down by issues, right? And so people choose of all the issues that are affecting the country, one or so that they favor, and that's, they make that the most popular one, and then choose. So it gets very complicated.
Yeah, we're gonna see at the tail end of Ellenberg's chapter, another way of looking at that I don't think anybody has yet just proposed at this point, but it's hard to draw valid conclusions that we can all agree with when there are more than two choices. Let's put it that way, because there are different ways of looking at the data, and that's what he is doing in this chapter of this book. All right. I want to depart from the discussion that we've had here and look at a Supreme Court case. It's a case that started in Virginia, went all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court, and ultimately it's changed over time. Okay? Two individuals, Darrell Renard Adkins and William Jones, robbed a man at gunpoint. They kidnapped this individual and then killed him. Both of them were brought to the court. Each of the individuals say, it wasn't me, it was him. And the other guy says, no, it wasn't me, it was him that shot the individual. This is in the state of Virginia, which has the death penalty. Okay? The jury believed Jones and convicted Adkins of capital murder and sentenced him to death. I believe that it's roughly 25 years ago. Okay. It wound up going all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court. In the appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court, it was revealed that Adkins was convicted, is mildly mentally retarded. He had an IQ of 59. The court concluded that it was okay to execute Adkins, citing a 1989 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in a particular case. In other words, they had a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1989. This was, the Virginia Supreme Court case was much later. Now, in 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed itself, citing the Eighth Amendment. Anybody remember what the Eighth Amendment is?
Cruel and unusual punishment.
Cruel and unusual punishment. What's cruel and unusual punishment? Is it what the founders who passed the Bill of Rights meant by cruel and unusual punishment? Or is it what we think of as cruel and unusual punishment? In 1789, Samuel Livermore of New Hampshire said he was opposed to this amendment to the Constitution. He said in the future, this would allow soft-hearted future generations to outlaw necessary punishments. Wow, is that insightful, huh? 1789. We shouldn't have this as an amendment because future generations will be soft-hearted. What's cruel and unusual punishment?
Drawing and quartering.
It's solitary confinement.
Yeah, that's what's worse than that.
That's been up recently.
How about cutting off an ear? That was not cruel and that was not considered cruel in 1789.
Some places
Just
in the world,
like
it's not considered cruel, is it?
Yes.
Okay, so in 1989, executing a mentally retarded person was not considered cruel and unusual punishment.
Excuse me, you know what the vote was on that?
I do not know.
6-3.
6-3.
Okay, now, in 2012, the Supreme Court of the United States reversed this. Sandra Day O'Connor, and here's the connection of this to what our discussion is, wrote in her opinion that polls show overwhelming public opposition to the execution of mentally retarded or mentally deficient criminals, and therefore it cannot be used. That's 2012. Okay? Others writing in that opinion said, cruel has to be defined by state lawmakers. You can't use polls. Harken back to Samuel Livermore in 1789. Okay? We're not going to use polls to determine this. It's got to be the lawmakers in the states.
So did they push it back to the states?
Well, okay,
That's it.
but there's more to the opinion.
Aren't the lawmakers going to use polls in order to decide?
No, not in this case, not. Apparently, they have already rendered a decision that says this cannot be based on polls. It's got to be the state lawmakers that help us define this in this case. In 1989, there were only two states, Georgia and Maryland, that forbid the execution of the mentally retarded.
Those were not the two states I would think.
They are not the two states that you would think.
That's a little surprising.
This case is in 2002, and in the majority opinion, they state that 30 states had laws against the execution of the mentally retarded. 30. That's a majority,
Don't they say mentally deficient?
mentally
I
deficient.
think they're retarded.
I think you're right. I'm old. I went through those changes when they occurred in federal law when I was working with the New Jersey Department of Education. And I worked on a floor that had two divisions, one for special education, one for curriculum development. I was in the curriculum development. And that federal law created enormous numbers of people that had to be hired in order to implement the law at the state level. And their assistant superintendent wanted us to take all of our office supplies out of a room and give them that room on our side of the floor. And we advised our assistant commissioner, don't do it, we'll never get it back.
That's the law of education.
And so the response to that was, the restrooms are on our side of the floor. Would you ask your employees to use restrooms elsewhere in the building?
Bureaucrats.
Bureaucrats, right? And then somebody had their children take a cardboard box in which a refrigerator had been shipped and painted it as an outdoor toilet. And it was placed in the parking space of the assistant commissioner for special education.
Jeez. What state was this?
New Jersey. It made the trend paper. Yeah. Do I dare say who encouraged his children to make that?
That's obvious.
Okay, now, that's the majority decision, or the majority opinion. Scalia is writing in the minority. And he says, there are only 18 states that forbid the execution of the mentally deficient. Oh yes, there are 12 other states that forbid execution of anyone. And that's how they got to 30, the majority. And those are in law in those states. So it's true that there are 30 states in which the mentally retarded or mentally deficient cannot be executed, but 12 of those states is you can't execute anybody for a crime. Okay. How do we aggregate those results? One side says you can't put them together under one title. And the other says, wait a minute, only 18 states forbid the execution of the mentally deficient. So how we aggregate data, and this isn't the case where there's 3 possibilities, there are only 2. How we aggregate data from surveys, in particular, is really, really complicated. It's not something that we necessarily would agree on, and the way we aggregate it sometimes is based on our own personal beliefs, that there is no absolute standard as to how you can aggregate the data. And that therein lies the problem as presented by Owen. How do we aggregate data when there are more than 2 choices? If we agree that the majority rules, then clearly you take a vote. You've got yes or no, and you got it. It's very clear. But if there are 3 choices, frequently it isn't clear. And the way that different people aggregate those results is based on their own personal beliefs. And what did the Supreme Court say about poll results? No, you can't use those poll results. It's got to be put into state law that we are going to abide by in this case. And even there, it's not clear what is the best way to aggregate the results. Okay? Any questions? So much for Supreme Court cases, right? Sometimes they're just as problematic as the Electoral College, right? For us.
But the one thing that happens though in the Supreme Court case is they do deliberate it and look at it in depth.
And somebody probably pointed that out and they argued about whether it was okay to include that, to aggregate the two numbers together.
Right.
I wonder what will happen once all the states are now putting ballot propositions about right to life, the abortion.
Yeah.
Whether the Supreme Court will change based on what the states have decided.
Well, they'll have to, somebody's gonna have to bring that case before them in
Right.
order for them to make that change.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like this.
Which is, I think, I think that's what they wanted to have happen. Because it didn't happen before. So,
Well, they wanted, or
Yeah, it's-
Congress to rule on it, and then it becomes a law, as opposed to just say, ruled by the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't have to go to the states, it could go to Congress.
that's the problem.
Yeah. And that's not reassuring, but still.
Yes,
We couldn't go to sleep.
Okay, so there's the summary of what I've just presented then, right? The majority says the 30 states forbid it, and they combine two things. They don't mention that they combine two slightly different situations. And Scalia points out, was it proper to add those two together to draw the conclusion?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now I want to look at a case in which Ellenberg looks at it and looks at it in a different way. Okay, and ultimately it's hypothetical, but he shows how we might go about elections when there are more than two choices. He argues in this chapter that whenever you've got three choices, it is not obvious. There are no rules, no standards by which we are all forced to analyze the situation. And we saw in that case earlier that two different news organizations with slants draw different conclusions. And we saw how each of them can draw different conclusions in a way that we would normally say is acceptable. Okay, so here we go. George Bush, by the way, did not get a majority in Florida in 2000. Al Gore didn't. But there's a third person running. That third person is Ralph Nader. Okay? Complicating the situation. It's not two choices, it's three choices.
Is that usually more than three?
Well, it's in some states, and as far as I know, it's gonna be very complicated this year because in some states there's gonna be three, in some states there's gonna be more, and it's possible that some will only have two. Okay. Now, do we agree with this statement? Everyone in Florida knew that Nader was not going to get the electoral votes in the electoral college. So if Nader isn't going to give, and we agree that the majority rules, who are those people going to say you've lost, but who would you vote for if Nader wasn't on the ballot? What's going to happen to the results? Who's going to win the election if that occurs? Or, okay?
Why do you say that?
Should have done it like Alaska,
Yes,
Yes.
great choice voting.
That would seem that everyone who voted for Ralph Nader would have voted for Gore.
Not everyone, but I think the majority.
Yeah, I
That's
would make the
closer
same
to Gore
assumption.
in politics than.
And that's.
Then
They're closer.
Constructive decision.
No,
No, but
I don't know, it doesn't seem like a reach to me.
Yeah.
Some
Okay,
things are great.
okay,
Yes.
well, I agree with both of those comments, okay?
You gotta look
So
at
how do we, when we have more than two choices, how should we be voting? And that's where we're gonna go.
Well, that's a good point, because I think in this coming election, there's going to be a lot of people that are voting a null vote really that means nothing because they don't like either party.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
As opposed to
It's
not.
a good thing Kennedy's running,
Right,
we've got
yeah.
no choice.
So it's true that if we agree with that comment, that most of the Nader votes would have gone to Gore, then if we give those Nader votes to Gore, he wins, and he would have been the president. But that's not how our system is working, because we have majority rule. Right? Majority rule. All right, here is Ellen Bird's solution. When you vote, you must vote your preferences. Who's your number one choice? Who's your number two choice? And who's your number three choice? Now, in this case, these are make-up numbers, okay, to illustrate. But 49% said our first choice is Bush, second choice is Gore, our third choice is Nader. We have another group that says our first choice is Gore, our second choice is Nader, and Bush is our third choice. That accounts for 25%. What about Gore, Bush, Nader? That's 24%. And the fourth one is Nader first, Gore, then Bush, accounts for only 22%. 2%, I'm sorry. Thank you. So what you do in this case is, it's clear that Nader is not going to get the votes. He's not first choice. He's only first choice by 2% of the people. And that pretty much coincides with that 1.6% that I reported on the previous slide. Gore and these two come up to the 49%, which is what we saw before. But if we drop Nader out here, Gore gets the votes. And so there are some places in our country in which there are more than three choices. If there are more than three choices, you must vote your preferences.
So this is a process that's used.
This is a process.
You drop the lower.
Rather than having a runoff election,
Right.
you do it this way, and you drop off the person.
With the lowest votes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But why wasn't there a Bush, Nader, Gore?
Because nobody voted that way.
That's just a made-up sample.
This is a made hypothetical. But you drop off the lowest one total, and then you look at, but you don't lose anybody's vote. You don't lose anybody's vote in this method. And so this is a way of looking at majority rule in a way that you don't have to do a runoff election.
So how is Gore winning? Because even if you take the combination of the two, it's 49.
But when you drop Nader off here, their second choice is Gore, and so Gore gets those 2%.
That's just how the process works.
That's how the process works.
Or he gets all those who said Gore was their second choice.
Yeah.
Is this
He
all,
doesn't get the ones who said
Right.
Bush was their
Right.
third choice.
Yeah.
is this all based on that all the electoral votes in Florida or wherever go to the winner?
First knows.
Winner take all.
Yeah,
It's winner.
It could be still be.
Because that seems to be one of the major problems.
Yeah. And so
So that's another.
So winner takes all is not necessarily majority rule, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so this is a proposal to overcome when we have more than two choices.
How many, if you're gonna reform things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a proposal.
Right, I'm not sure.
If my memory serves me, we've had two presidential, well, maybe three presidential elections where the person who got the most votes didn't get the most electoral votes. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think there's
I think there's three.
Yeah, I think there's one back in the late 1800s.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
There-
No, it's in the 1870s,
Yeah.
where it goes to, yeah.
But what was the point?
My point behind this is that, you know, if that's the case, the issue is not the mechanism, it's electoral college.
Yes.
Yep.
But you would still potentially have a problem like this if it was done with the three choices
Well,
if it was done
you know, you just
nationwide.
don't count Idaho votes, you know. You know, the other issue is the time difference. You've got a country that really should have 4 time zones, that's 3. And you got people voting in California when the election is
Over.
But the results cannot come out before before the.
Yeah, but they're recording information as they go.
well,
But they have been wrong. But it does color for sure.
Then you got Hawaii,
you're
3 more hours.
Yeah, that's true.
in California or Washington or Oregon, and you know that it's moot because the issue's over. What do you do?
Right. And sometimes people just don't even bother to vote
That's right.
because of that.
They're not allowed to report it. So that's not true, that you're not allowed to report.
They're
it. So
recording
that was-
information early in the evening. It's just
But
not,
it's-
it's not
but it's-
exact polling results. I think that, we watch polling all the time on the nights of big elections.
Yeah.
And I think normally, so California closes at 7, which would be 10 our time. And I think that at 10 o'clock, they've already started, not necessarily reporting results that, you know, they're.
Talent.
Yeah, they're telling, I mean, if they're calling it interim or something, they're calling it
Exit
something.
polling,
Yes,
who did you vote for, et cetera.
Wasn't there that?
And
little
again,
town
the
in-
problem is polling, really? Yeah,
Yeah.
the problem is polling.
Well, yeah, and if you have somebody standing outside of a polling place, how many people stop and tell them how they voted?
Somehow they can get enough of a sampling that they seem to be able to extrapolate that. Yeah, I know that.
Yeah.
Well, again,
It's the
and,
intercept that,
yeah,
that's
the problem is polling.
intercepting people you know.
Right, but part of the polling problem is, right, how many people pre-voted, how many people mailed in their
Absolutely.
ballot. And that's probably going more, so they're not sampling it. That's one of the biggest problems with polls,
Yeah.
they're no longer sampling it. Right.
We don't have landline phones in our house anymore for them to call us.
And TikTok has a bigger influence than,
Yes,
Actually, it is a minor thing, but there were actually 5 presidents who won the presidency without winning
okay.
the popular vote.
Which were the others?
Well, remember Jackson versus Adams?
Yeah,
It went to the Congress,
yeah.
you know,
Oh, that's.
Jackson had won the popular vote in that election. Tilden and Hayes are the 2 we were talking about earlier, the ones that are.
How much separated them?
Huh?
How many?
1824, 1876, 1880, oh, how much was the margin?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Jackson had 42% of the electoral, of the popular vote, and Adams had 31. So it was a 15% difference in vote. But because it wasn't enough, you know, to get over that thing, then it went into the
And there were multiple others on the ballot.
there were a total of 4.
Total of
Yeah.
4.
Right, and in 1876, there were 4. In fact, there are 4 in every case. The second one was Tilden and Hayes, and that was because the Republicans refused to accept the electors of a disputed state, Georgia, The third one was Cleveland versus Harrison. Cleveland won didn't get the over 40, he had 48.6, and Harrison had 47.8. So, in a sense, that's not too bad. Gore he had 48.4% versus 47.9% for Bush. And Clinton Hillary had 48.2% versus Trump was 46.1. So those are the 5.
The interesting thing about that is that popular vote was Hillary, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the differential in California,
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
that's what was the difference.
Well,
And so they only have so many electoral votes.
Some of the others, it was just,
Yeah.
yeah.
So if you took California out of the mix, bit more popular vote for Trump.
Oh, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, there's no way a Republican right now would win in California.
Right.
They haven't passed, I mean, Reagan.
Oh, Reagan, yeah.
To go back to this is one method to get us away from that craziness. The electoral, I think we agree at the national level, the electoral college is a strange kind of beast, and influences why we see candidates campaigning in certain states and never campaigning in other states. They know what the results are, they're not gonna change it, so therefore they're not gonna make the effort to campaign in those states. But again, I wanna go back to Ellenberg. There is no standard that says this is the way that the results should be interpreted and how we draw valid conclusions from them. Thus the title of the chapter. There is no such thing as public opinion. By the way, Ellenberg himself, in another context, has testified both at the Wisconsin Supreme Court and at the U.S. Supreme Court about gerrymandering. And he says there is no such thing as a standard for what is gerrymandered and what isn't gerrymandered. We live in a state that we look at the boundaries and they look kind of squirrely. So it's hard for us to say we shouldn't be gerrymandering in this state. And we know why that has come about in this state. But one of the other conclusions that Ellenberg comes to is that we tend to gerrymander ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
People live for young people that they want to live with.
That's correct. And so this notion of gerrymandering is equally problematic. There's no standard that you can go to the court and say, they violated the standard, therefore it should be thrown out, right? There is no such standard.
Wouldn't it be possible to set up a standard that, depending on the, and I just read an article this morning about gerrymandering and happened to use North Carolina as an example, which is an outstanding example. But depending on the percentages of party registration, that the percentages of slanted districts should be within a certain amount of that percentage.
Well, I think it's a question of who gets to decide.
That, unfortunately, today, that's
Yeah,
what
if it was an independent commission, the issue would probably disappear. Because of who sucks getting ignored, it's the
Independent
issue.
commission, didn't they?
What?
I think they did have an independent commission, yeah.
California did too.
I was gonna say, if you're talking about solutions, I heard one that I thought was the best in the terms of that if you don't do it locally, so you get rid of gerrymandering, right? So what you do is you have people vote in the state of Maryland, and if 10% of we're gonna have to go hard, let's say 20% were Republican and 80% were Democrat. The Republicans would get 20% of the vote. Now, it wouldn't be per local area. And so the Republicans, depending on the election, would have to rank what your candidate. So in other words, do you want Andy Harris as the #1 Republican for the whole state? Or do you want, somebody else to be the number? And then you rank them down. So in other words, if you get 3,
So is that a weighting? that they're
What about
talking-
independents? What do you do with them?
let's say,
Yeah, but unfortunately, we have a
Percent of registration.
They would get
a tradition that representatives represent people in a geographic area. That's, I'm talking now about the state legislature, and that carries over to Congress, the House, but not to the Senate. I think there are plenty of issues here that we can say, the way we're doing it right now isn't a fair representation. Although again, it depends how you want to frame the question.
I think it's fair.
Maybe we should vote for who we don't want for president.
Okay.
What's left over?
That's what we're doing. The problem is, we don't need them.
First of all, with a question, and then I have another conclusion to look at. We will have 3 or more candidates in many states. So how should the electoral votes be determined in those states?
Which is
the example of
Maine and somebody else.
Maine
Isn't
and Alaska,
Yeah,
Maine and Alaska are the
2.
the only
The two
ones
that-
that have based on
The
popularity.
new ranked choice voting, the splits are Maine and Nebraska.
Nebraska, I know.
Nebraska,
Yeah.
else, because
And-
there's
and
The
Maine.
ones that split, it's not winner take all. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's mostly, but they have one, winner take most.
Well, I see.
So like if that were California, for example, today, and I don't know, I'm not sure if there are some northern California states that probably might, the valley might run in that direction. That'd be hard to say.
Orange County.
Orange County is,
it's totally changed.
has totally changed,
Oh,
yeah. It's no longer, it's Democrat now.
Well, the solution, of course, is we've got the electoral college, and whoever gets the most votes gets everything, right?
Should that be expanded, do you think?
I would love to see it expanded. I would love to see proportional electoral college,
Just give
In other words, you get the percentage of what you got in the state, that's the percentage of your.
Or let the
Electoral
electoral
college.
college voters make decisions instead of being told what they're going to do.
Or just
Well,
go
that,
with the
that
majority vote,
dilutes the.
majority vote, period.
Yeah.
But again, to abolish the electoral college is one solution.
Yes.
But again, if there are 3 candidates, 3 or more candidates, we've got to address that issue as well. Not only in voting, but in polls and so on, right?
I think that ranked choice
Yes, that's my favorite.
really.
Yes, absolutely,
Would help a
absolutely.
lot.
And there are places around the country in local elections and so forth that have in fact adopted that, so you don't have to have a runoff election.
Yeah, if Alaska had not had ranked choice, Sarah Palin would be the representative.
Now, given Ellenberg's conclusion that there is no such thing as popular opinion, what is an elected official to do? There are the choices.
Can you define public opinion?
Well, again, when there are, Ellenberg says,
Well, she must have defined it.
Ellenberg says that if there are 3 or more choices, there is no valid way to sort that stuff out. There is no, I shouldn't say that. There is no accepted way of sorting that out. Therefore, you cannot conclude, just as we did in that one survey,
Yeah.
where we said, here's Fox News, they have one headline, MSNBC has this headline, they're both can be drawn out of the survey, but they're miles apart. And so therefore, we don't have, quote, we haven't defined what popular opinion is, just in the same way that we do not have a standard for,
But it's based so
Jeremy.
much on the idea of majority, right?
yeah,
The public opinion
Yeah.
has to be,
Oh, but,
it's a part of it.
It's the majority of the people.
and the error comes from reducing the complexity to a binary choice.
that's right.
You know,
That's right.
there is complexity in public opinion. If you could if you could get the complexity in there, there would be such a thing
Yeah.
as public opinion, but
Yeah.
not if it's a binary choice.
But the way we go about doing it, and I think this goes back to what you said earlier. There's also all of us have seen the survey, the push-pull survey, in which
Yeah.
the sequence of questions, leads you down to giving the opinion that the person who paid for the poll wants in the first place. And so now it's, how is the poll designed? Does that create problems in and of itself? Does it lead you to thinking things that you never thought of before? And secondly, Ellen Berg, from a mathematician's point of view, says that if there are more than two choices, then it's hard to draw valid conclusions that you can, depending upon how you look at it, you're going to come to different conclusions. Okay. But for all those elected officials, what do you think of this? Two choices that elected officials have.
I think it's like a society test, a sociology test.
Well, elected officials, for one thing, they have their own pollsters. And a good pollster is going to be very careful, and they're going to give them unbiased information because they're going to design their campaign around that. That's completely different than what a news organization or a political organization would do, because they want to lead the public in one direction or the other. So it depends on where the polling data is from, I think. But you do get, the bottom one sounds like something Trump would say: I was elected to lead, not to watch the polls. And polling data contradicts itself. I think we've all seen that. It depends on who's analyzing it and and how they present it. So.
How they structure the questions can really.
Leading your polls up until,
Well,
elections.
yeah, but the problem with that is that you're looking at national polls that are all done differently and all have different, and a lot of them don't have they're aggregating a bunch of different polls together when they say stuff like that. And plus, you have a lot of polls that are done with an N of 400, which is a plus or minus 4.9% error rate, either direction. If you have 1,500, but what I like about Pew is they usually have thousands, but they still haven't, after 2016, when it became so evident that people were no longer, that you could no longer get a random sampling based on home telephone numbers because people weren't answering their phones, they started using polls online, and they started using groups of people that they would go to that would sign up to do polls. So that, how representative is that? Well, they have tons of demographic information, and they can choose on, they randomly select from their aggregate.
Let me ask you a question. How many people in this room have been polled?
You've never been polled?
No, Amy Harris sends me polls on a regular basis.
I think you're talking about.
That's, so somebody calls you up for
Yeah.
your
Well,
opinion.
nobody does that anymore.
Well, how do they do it?
But what I just said.
It's all
they do it
online.
it's
It's all online.
It's email or online, it's
Yeah.
mostly online now.
Now everybody's sending
We even
text
have,
messages.
we now even, there's an outfit in Canada, and I hope this is probably used routinely, that will see what you're looking at online, and they'll throw an invitation out. I did do that one time when we were doing polling in Saudi Arabia, because there was no way to get individual numbers or to draw random sampling, so we used a company that, because everyone has a cell phone, we did intercept space, from people when they were online. It's really, yeah, I don't, that's why I don't do that type of polling anymore, because it's become too complicated to be and less reliable.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Now that we've solved all the country's problems, thank you for coming. I don't have anything further. Yes, sir.
It's interesting because when I signed up for this, I didn't know quite what you were gonna do, but I think you came up very close. And one thing I have somewhat come to the conclusion is that we, the United States, are in a huge transition era. Major. We are not alone. My wife is British. We have friends. Our Christmas list. We have two lists: American and international. So I'm reasonably familiar with England and France. And they got the same game. Yeah, if not worse. So if that's the fact, and I think we have to accept that fact that we're in such a transition. The electorate, and I include myself in this, is incapable of translating what the hell is going on. And as a nation, as individuals, as people, we gotta be smarter. We gotta be more subtle.
Piggybacking on that, I had an interesting discussion with somebody one day who had just voted in Maryland voting. It was probably when there were lots of things on the ballot. And she said, "Oh, I came here from California. I used to hate that booklet they'd send out with pro and con, and writing and all the written things about it. And I like this a lot better because there's nothing on there that tells me what it is." Oh, great.
Like this.
But there are problems for both, because in California voted in California, you can attest to this. It gets very confusing because they write they do their write-up in such a way that it will make you
Angry.
no. I think they do it so to confuse you.
Confusing, yeah.
Because it's all really, really confusing. And
Well,
then you go to the other side
if
and
you
it's
ever
balance.
lived in Chicago, and I have, there's a bar, and the bar says Democratic. You pull it across, and the whole damn ballot is Democratic. It's over.
Yeah.
I remember those from years ago. I haven't seen one of those
That-
in years. You can vote for each one, or you can pull the whole party lever.
Part of it.
Yeah, I think it's time to have another class from somebody who understands the history and the law involved with why we have the electoral college. Because I think that would be a really good class.
Well,
It needs to be first thing in September.
I would be much too biased. I would just say, hey, we gotta have that.
But we're not asking you your opinion, we're asking for the history.
That's different.
That's the difficulty of being a teacher.
I'm a collector of tax stamps. And things were greatly simplified during the War of 1812. The Congress passed a law, we need to raise so much money. They divvied it up among the states, and the states were responsible for collecting that money. Who do you get the money from? Landowners.
Right.
Period. Who gets to vote? Landowners.
Right.
White male.
Yes.
Yeah,
I was in a bar not too long ago, and the discussion was, do we need a constitutional Congress?
what is it?
You need to do, rewrite
Rewrite the Constitution.
Oh,
My brother,
And aren't we doing that?
yeah,
we do it all the
That's why we
time.
have
Yeah,
amendments.
yeah.
my brother teaches at University, Utah State, up in Logan, Utah. And he teaches a class on the Constitution, and that is the assignment of the students. They have to rewrite the Constitution, and then they have to present it to the class, a rewrite, and then they vote and to see who's, you
That
know,
would be interesting.
and, oh, it's fascinating, of course, you know, it would be, but,
We teach that here.
he comes out here, right, he's the one, he's the smart one in the family. Anyway, but, you know, so yes, I don't know if we need a constitutional convention to totally rewrite it, but there are certain parts of it that definitely.
Well, as I say, I think that's what we're doing.
But we do it piecemeal.
That's right, but
Yeah.
nonetheless,
Yeah.
look at the issues that are up for discussion. These are very primal issues
Yeah.
about the Constitution.
Well, that
that are-
immigration
that
is
the
it already.
founders
Yeah.
really did not address.
Or screwed up entirely.
Well, and I was thinking about what you
Screwed up
said,
more
that, Britain and France are in the same
Yeah.
kind of boat, because we're all using something that is so outdated for how society has changed.
They're not democratic republics.
But to go along with what you said.
Well, no, they still are using something that was made
Yeah.
hundreds of years ago.
And see, the idea of doing away with the electoral college, is contrary to having a democratic republic.
No.
No,
A democratic republic, each state has a voice.
Yeah, there's a proposal out there, which is basically the popular vote proposal, says that states who have, if enough states agree to this covenant, they will vote with the popular vote regardless. In other words, so if you know, your state would have voted Republican, but the popular vote was Democrat, your state will vote Democrat.
That's been out there for about 5 years now.
Oh, it's been out there for
And they have-
10 or 20
And
years.
they have attained MEC, have they?
Yes, they are, what, about, I think all but
I think Reich,
12, we're about 12 short, I think.
Reich used to be the secretary.
Right, Robert Reich, yeah.
Robert Reich, yes.
Later,
But came up, that proposal.
Yeah, and basically they're about, if about 12 more states would agree to it, then we would, it doesn't eliminate electoral college, but it bypasses it. You know, it basically says, we're going to ignore it.
Is there any other reason for the electoral college other than that? I think the whole electoral college was set up so to ensure that every state
Oh.
has some representation.
Let's look back to the late 1780s when
Right.
that was created. And communication is a little different today than it was then. And so they sent
Yeah.
designated individuals to take the results to the Capitol to take that vote. And, the number of electors was based on the population.
It still is.
Yeah, it still is.
Well, look at our Senate. When you have 4 guys in 2 states that have less people than California's got, they got to, North Dakota, South Dakota.
Why?
Well, that was part in order to get the small states to have an important voice in one.
But they have that in the Senate.
I understand, that's,
They have the
They
representation in the
do,
Senate.
but if you do away with the electoral college, you've heard Bob say this, and I can't remember now what it is, but I happen to agree with him because I understand public opinion a little better. All you have to do as a candidate is flood the MSAs of New York, Chicago, California, San Diego, San Francisco, Seattle, maybe somewhere in Texas, Florida.
Massachusetts, I know.
Yeah, you would, as a candidate, you would just flood those and you would kind of ignore everything else. Now, you could also say they're doing that now because they don't bother to go to
Right.
other states.
Now they're ignoring California and Maryland
And Maryland.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
that's not representative either.
Yeah.
We would much rather have, if you let, if it was based on the popular vote, they would have to campaign in every single state.
Yep.
Every single state.
That's not true. There'd be no reason for them to go to California because it's a done deal.
No,
No, you're saying if there
No.
wasn't an electoral college, then
Right.
you would want any vote you could get, so.
right. You wouldn't even have to go to Wyoming, because the votes in Wyoming might be the difference between you and
Yeah, but
another.
if everyone, if it's a Democratic state, I don't know what the numbers are in California anymore. Probably something like 80% Democrat. And if that's the case, why would I send a candidate there other than maybe one?
Because the 20% might be the difference in the total, you know.
I mean, talking about Maryland, right, you wouldn't necessarily go to Montgomery County, but you come over here,
Yeah.
we didn't. Well, he knew we had